says internet connection unstable.
Which internet are you?
Okay, everybody, are we back? You seem like we have a better connection. All right, thanks for sticking with us all through the technical difficulty, although it was much more picturesque down in the main room of the restaurant. I suppose it's better off that I'm up in our office right now. We have a little bit stronger connection, it seems like, up here. So let's back up a little bit, a few minutes, and we'll start again. I was in the middle of telling you guys about the different regions of Burgundy and kind of their general characteristics. We talked about Chablis, right? It's being white wine only, very cold, right next to Champagne. And then we move down to the Cote de Nuits, which is the Côte d'Or, which is combined Côte de Beaune and the Cote de Nuits. And we also mentioned beyond that the Côte Chalonnaise and then the Maconnais below that. We didn't talk about Beaujolais because Beaujolais is sort of like a subregion, as I mentioned earlier. They grow Gamay, they don't grow Pinot Noir there. So we leave that for a whole separate class. So I think it's best to understand Burgundy as well. The last minute joiner here too, great. So the best way to understand the different classifications of Burgundy in general is to understand kind of the way that the vineyards are classified. And I talked a bit, hopefully you guys could hear me through a little bit of the static, but thinking about Burgundy in concentric circles, right? So Burgundy is kind of the biggest circle. And then beyond that, you have the regions, whether it's Chablis or Cote de Nuits or whatever it is. And then we'll use Cote de Nuits as an example. Inside of that, you have villages, right? And in the Cote de Nuits, there's 7 most important villages, which we'll talk about in a minute. And then inside those villages, there's also vineyards as well. So vineyards can be classified in 3 ways. The unclassified vineyards are called lieux-dits, which is essentially a site that a producer is very excited about, that they think is of importance to actually talk about and make wine into a single vineyard. Or you also have Premier Cru, which is the next step up. So if you think about kind of like a pyramid here. And then you also have Grand Cru as your main. So there are only 33 Grand Cru vineyards in all of Burgundy and in the Côte d'Or, and there's 1 in Chablis. So 34 total in the entire region. So you can imagine when we start talking about vineyards as being Grand Cru as to why they become excessively expensive. They're very scarce. They're super sought after. So we'll talk about what all those are as well. We'll kind of gloss over them as we go through, but we're going to taste 3 different wines from 3 different villages in the Cote de Nuits. All of them are lieux-dits sites, so single vineyards of that producer's kind of specific importance. In general, I think it's also important to understand kind of just the baseline of history of Burgundy, as well as kind of the climate and soil type. Now that stuff's all kind of like super nerdy sommelier things where you start talking about rocks and all those kinds of things. But I will show you a picture of a rock. I do promise there's at least one rock picture in this entire slideshow. But the general history of the region overall, it starts with really actually these kind of Celtic tribesmen that came into Burgundy around the year 0, basically, in like 0 AD. So the 2,000 years ago, they planted a little bit of grapes. And then the Romans came in around 50 AD or so, and they started to really kind of embed viticulture into Burgundy as well. But the true story and kind of the major part of the history of Burgundy really comes with the Roman Catholic Church, in fact. So If you remember anything about the history of Burgundy, if you remember at least these two monastic orders, then you're already worlds ahead of anyone else that's studying Burgundy, and you can impress your friends by knowing what the two names of these orders are. So the Benedictines came first, and they were around the year 920 or so. And they were most responsible for kind of laying the land of Burgundy. They documented everything. They had this idea of like microclimates and how different places on the same hill could produce wines of different styles, which then becomes what we now call different vineyards on the same hill. And they also were gifted tons and tons of land. Like the picture that I showed you before we took a quick Wi-Fi break was the picture of the Chambertin Clos de Bez, which was actually a gift in 620 from the Duke of Malguer, the Duke of Burgundy at the time, to the Abbey of Bez. So the actual Benedictine Abbey of the vineyard now called Clos de Bez. So as what will happen with anyone that is gifted lots of free land that they can make wine out of, they sort of got like fat and happy. And they started to, in the mind of some of their members, like slip in terms of their rigorous ways. So an offshoot of the Benedictines came around in around 1100 or so. They're called the Cistercians, and they were essentially all about grueling manual labor, very monastic lifestyle. They thought the Benedictines had gone soft, and so they decided that they were going to reclaim what it meant to be a monk. And they were sort of like the dominating power in Burgundy after that, after the Benedictines sort of ruled the era for the first couple hundred years. The Cistercians are most important because they actually put in real manual labor to clear all these hillsides that are now the Clos de Bez, that are now the Grand Crus of Burgundy, right? The Clos Vougeot and Echezeaux and those kinds of places that we'll look at a little bit later on as well. But they literally tilled the land and made it actually usable, in fact. So very important for those two members. That's sort of the baseline. And you're going to start to see a lot of different terms around the kind of monastic orders overall, right? So things like chapitre or abbé or whatever these are, they're all kind of like chapel and that kind of stuff. You're going to see those very commonly used in the names of Burgundy wines, of vineyards, and that kind of stuff. So it really comes back to the Roman Catholic Church, as do many things in this era of Europe. The general, just a couple of notes about the climate of Burgundy, because it does actually help you to understand what is in the glass. Really, we have to remember that Burgundy is kind of it's kind of like crappy weather overall. There's 4 seasons, right? And like they're all very, very distinctive seasons. So you get a lot of hail and frost in the fall and sometimes in the spring as well. Like hail is a constant problem in Burgundy, actually. And the summers are nice, but they're relatively short. So you really get to see a drastic vintage variation in Burgundy as well, which is what makes it interesting for wine aficionados as well, is that each year a wine can taste different based on what happened in the vineyards that year. So a great example is the difference between 14s and 15s. So as a general rule of thumb, I'll give you a secret of dissecting Burgundy vintages. Generally, a year that's great for whites is not great for reds, and the other way around, right? So 14, as an example, was pretty cool, considered to be an epic vintage for white wines, one of the best in the last 20 years or so. And the reds were a little thin though, right? So great producers will still make great wine, and every year they're just going to make a lot less of it, right? But the reds are sort of considered to be brighter, lighter. You should drink them much earlier, those kinds of things. And the whites you should save and let them age for longer. 15 was a much warmer year, as an example. So the reds are considered to be more long-lived. They're going to have more structure. They're going to hold up for longer, and they're going to have more fruit. Whereas the whites got a little fat and a little flabby, right? So you should drink 15 whites earlier than 14 whites is kind of the general thought of how that goes overall. Because I did promise you a picture of rocks, I will show you a picture of the soil of Burgundy here. So I'm going to try to share my screen again, and hopefully that our connection is in much better shape this time. All right, so this is another vineyard in Burgundy. This is actually in the village of Von Romine, where they make really, really expensive, very, very good wines. But you can see there's like literal rocks all over the ground. So this is a mixture of clay and limestone primarily, and this mix is called colluvium. And the different mixture in each vineyard is what's considered to make the wine sort of taste and smell different in the glass overall. So if you're looking here, you can see obviously they're kind of reddish brown, like clay is kind of the base. And then if you look really closely, it's all flecked with white bits of limestone. Right. So clay is good for water retention, which is what allows the vines to take hold in the ground. And limestone actually limits the amount of nutrients in the grape. So I won't get much more scientific or nerdy about that because we are planning on actually drinking some wine, as I hope you have already been drinking some wine at this point. If you haven't, certainly start now, because we're going to talk about the vineyards and the villages of the Cote de Nuits kind of in north to south order. So the nice thing about Burgundy, and that it is obviously very complex and very, it can be difficult to understand, at least everything runs north to south. So you can kind of keep things organized and oriented in your mind. In the Cote de Nuits, that northernmost region, the most important one, is 7 villages that you should remember or, well, be able to recognize, we'll say. Again, there's no test here because that's not fun. This is more about having fun. So the 7 villages north to south, just quickly, and then we'll talk about each one and taste 3 wines from 3 different villages as well. Gevrey-Chambertin is the northernmost. And then you also have Chambol-Musigny behind that. Moret-Saint-Denis below, then Vougeot, Flagey-Echezot, and then 2 villages called Von Romine, which I showed you a picture of briefly to look at dirt, and then Nuits-Saint-Georges below that as well. All of these vineyards and villages we talk about because they have Grand Cru vineyards in them, except for Nuits-Saint-Georges, which is the last one, which only has Premier Cru. However, this is where the majority of all of the Grand Cru wines in Burgundy exist, in these essentially these 6 villages. So the highway that runs through them, in fact, as well, is actually called the RN74, and you can, in fact, just actually drive straight through all of the Grand Cru vineyards. It's now called DN74, but historically it's been RN74. There's actually a famous restaurant in San Francisco that specializes in Burgundy. It's called RN74, obviously, and it's now a UNESCO World Heritage Site. The actual Grand Cru vineyards themselves. It's actually a beautiful drive, and you can kind of like drive through, and all the vineyards are marked, and you can actually see where each one is. So if you haven't gone yet, I'm sure some of you have been to Burgundy and traveled, then I would highly recommend going in and seeing for yourself. It's the best way to learn for sure.
Hey, Watson.
Yes, sir.
Just while I was thinking about it, and so connection's much better on everyone's end, but could you talk a little bit about the names? It's just something that came to mind if I didn't know how the naming system works.
Yeah, definitely. The names of the villages, you mean?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so that's actually, Jamie actually led me in perfectly to my next point as I was getting ready to talk.
Here we go.
Yeah, there it is. Right? Yeah, all things will come. So anyway, so Gevrey-Chambertin is the first village, and if you're talking about the name Gevrey and it's hyphenated with the word Chambertin, that is, as we saw earlier in the picture of Chambertin-Clos-de-Bez, the most important vineyard in Gevrey. So it's like the right dead center Grand Cru vineyard, Les Chambertin. It's the most important one, and all the other Grand Crus sort of sit on either the north or the south side of that vineyard. The idea behind naming your villages Gevrey-Chambertin or Moret-Saint-Denis, which Clos-Saint-Denis is the next one south, is actually a marketing term. In fact, it came about in the 1940s and 50s when villages started to realize that they needed people to come see them, to be able to show them their wines, to be able to sell them, to be able to keep making money and a living. So it's like it's a tourism ploy, essentially, right? So if you now know that Chambertin is in Gevrey, it makes Gevrey-Chambertin seem much more illustrious. And by nature, it actually is, for sure. So all the villages, actually, well, almost all of them, have their most important vineyard appended to the end of the name, in fact. So Gevrey-Chambertin specifically, which you have in your glass, actually, it's by Domaine du Rocher. This is it's actually the largest village of all the ones in the Cote de Nuits in terms of land mass. It's also the Cote d'Or's like largest appellation in general, but they only make reds here. No whites in Gevrey-Chambertin, although other villages will do a mixture of red and whites. They say reds only, it's what they're most known for. It's the best wines. They also have 9 Grand Cru vineyards. So this village has the most Grand Cru vineyards in Burgundy in general. 9 is a lot, 9 out of 34. And again, Chambertin being right there in the center. The names are all also sort of appended to Chambertin. So like an example, I won't run you through all 9 because you're not studying for a sommelier exam, but like La Trissière Chambertin, for example, is a Grand Cru vineyards to the north of Chambertin. Mazy Chambertin, Griot Chambertin, they're all really hammering home the fact that you know that Chambertin is there. So you also have really, really great Premier Cru vineyards here as well. I think that's a really kind of an interesting discussion point, is that sometimes a Premier Cru vineyard, which we talked about, it goes Grand Cru, Premier Cru, then Ludi in terms of like legal classification and quality overall. Some Premier Cru vineyards can be better than Grand Cru vineyards, actually. Usually they're touching some part or a lot of Grand Cru vineyard sites, or they're formerly were cut out of a Grand Cru vineyard site as well. So something like Combote or Casetière, which is to the north of Chambertin, are really, really fantastic wines, and some of them in the hands of the right producer can be more expensive than Grand Crus. I think the most famous example here is probably the Clos Saint-Jacques. So this wine, if you've ever encountered it, there's 5 producers in the vineyard itself. It's astronomically priced, so if you ever happen to find one that you afford, or you can ask for a holiday gift, definitely go ahead and snag one. The tasting that you have here, I think we should probably take a quick pause from talking about vineyard names for a second and drink some wine. So you have Domaine du Rocher. It is a Ludi site called Champ. So it's a single vineyard. And in general, the reason I wanted to pick 3 different villages and teach this class in overall was that villages and vineyards themselves within the village tend to have kind of a general characteristic, right? So we say that wines from Gevrey taste like Gevrey-Chambertin. We say that wines from Chambon-Musigny taste like the place, taste like a wine from that location. And the winemaker's job is to sort of guide the grapes into the glass, right? So to really kind of embody this idea that the place is most important, but the winemaker's job is to not get in the way of producing great wine. So this first wine you have, I'll taste along with you as well. This is from 2018, and the wines in Gevrey, I think this is a pretty classic example, are considered to be, and if you want to call them like kind of more traditional genderized terms, we love to use those in wine speak. It's kind of a more masculine expression of Burgundy overall. So it's more power, more structure, and if you taste the wine, you can see this kind of like a drying sensation. The tannins are a little bit firmer in Gevrey overall, but you also have a lot of limestone in the soil here, which means that the wines are very floral and lifted. So you've got a lot of kind of like just very classic red fruit note, cherry, strawberry, whatever it might be, but also like spice box and potpourri, and the wines really start to jump out of your glass. This is a 5th generation winemaker named Pierre du Rocher, and he's clearly figured things out by now. Because the wines actually have a lot of finesse to them too. It's very hard to get Gevrey to taste good young. They oftentimes need a lot of aging because they are meant to be so structured and so powerful. But he does a good job of making his wine sort of expressive in youth. So this is the bottle. Actually, I have a copy of it here, or a sample of each here. I don't know if you can actually see them or not with the glare. But anyway, this is the first bottling here, and I would highly recommend finding some whenever you get a chance. Moving just to the south is Moret Saint-Denis. So you can kind of keep hanging out and drinking that wine as we go along, but the next wine we'll taste is from 2 more villages south in Chambol. But Moret Saint-Denis is connected to Gevrey. So if you look at it on a map, it looks like the villages are sort of far away, but they're actually just one after another, in fact. So one vineyard might actually run between two villages, which is a couple famous examples of that actually a little bit later on here. But Moret Saint-Denis, obviously hyphenated to Saint-Denis, is named after the Clos Saint-Denis. It's one of its most famous vineyards. There are 4 and a portion, 4.5, we'll say, Grand Cru vineyards here in Moret. 4 of them are all Clos. Clos is just a term for a walled vineyard. Actually, if you've ever seen that term pop up, and you'll see it all over in Burgundy and in other French wines as well. Clos just means at one point in time, and theoretically, hopefully still, there's like a wall that encircles the vineyard, usually a stone wall that was built by a monk like literally 1,000 years ago. So sometimes the wall's gone by this point. But there are 4 Clos here, and the 5th is a small part of a Grand Cru vineyard called Bonmar, which actually goes to the next village as well. Overall, because Moret is tiny, like these are all small, like villages is like an overstatement of to what these places are, but Moret is actually probably the smallest, if not definitely closest. So it has the highest average quality though of all wines in Burgundy, because 50% of them are either Premier Cru or Grand Cru, because the village is so small. Basically, they've been able to fit all the vineyards, or they're going to make it count, right? So if it's just that, then that's all they're going to make. They do make reds and whites, but a lot more reds here, for sure. Jumping down to Chambolle-Musigny, which is actually the wine we're going to taste next as well. So I mentioned these vineyards and these places are all contiguous. Bonmar is the vineyard that actually continues into Chambolle, and they have most of it. Only a tiny sliver, maybe 10 or 15%, is in Moret Saint-Denis. So
Watson, we've got a great question here.
Yeah. Who decides?
So, yeah, you can read it. Great.
Yeah. So I see I had the chat pulled up here on the side too. Really interesting question. So this was decided back in the 1930s by an organization, the INAO. There were 2 very famous winemakers, in fact, that were important in putting the system together. There's been all different types of classification systems throughout the eras of Burgundy. In the 1800s, there was a system called the Laval system, which is no longer in use. This is the current incarnation. So there were 2 producers, which we'll mention them again when we get to the very furthest south village called Nuits-Saint-Georges, named Henri Gouche. She's in Nuits-Saint-Georges. And then in Volnay, there was the Marquis d'Angeville. And they were tasked with deciding upon what are the best vineyards, what are Grand Cru, what are Premier Cru, and then what are just other parcels that are good, but should still have a name, but are not necessarily classified as either one of those. Because at the time, the entire wine market was dominated by different merchants, as opposed to the families making their own wine. It is called a négociant system. They would grow the grapes and then sell their wine to a merchant in town, and the merchant would make the wine. So they wanted to keep the power, these 2 small producers, to keep the power out of the hands of the merchants of Burgundy. So they agreed to do the system, and they agreed that they would not put any Grand Cru vineyards in their own villages, although some are very, very good in Nuits-Saint-Georges and in Volnay, as long as they would also not put Grand Cru vineyards in Beaune, which is kind of the main capital where most of the wine merchants owned land around. So it was kind of this it was one of my favorite stories actually in wine. It seems very sacrificial, but it was decided upon by these people and then written into law. So it is a legal classification, very, very heavily regulated. I hope that answered, probably answered more than you needed to know, but I think it's one of my favorite stories, so I wanted to pause and tell it for you. While we're talking about Grand Cru vineyards in general, Chambolle-Musigny has 2. I bet you can figure out what their most famous one is. If their village is named Chambolle-Musigny, then their most famous vineyard is in fact Les Musigny as well. And there are only 2 producers in the whole vineyard. It's a very historical producer named Georges Comte de Vogüé. He actually makes reds and whites out of Musigny, and then Jacques Frédéric Meunier as well. So That's like their claim to fame. And Chambol is actually probably my personal favorite village in in the Cote de Nuits. It's definitely a personal thing, right? Everyone has sort of different ideas, but and preferences. I like them because I think the wines are very elegant, very perfumed. And if you taste the second wine here, maybe you'll see some of that idea as well. And the wines tend to be very light on their feet, so they're kind of like the antithesis of Gevrey, right? So Gevrey is known for being more, we call it masculine, more power driven. Chambol is more, we might call it more feminine. If we're gonna again kind of take ourselves back to 2019 and before. They're considered to be more high toned, more elegant. The fruit is more polished, and it's has this kind of like savory cedar spice note to the wines. They also have a very famous vineyard here called Les Amoureux, which means the lovers, and it's actually just below Musigny. So it also, all these things sort of play into this image that the wines are a little more like caressing on the palate, I think. The science behind it, though, is actually because there's a lot of limestone in the soil. So not to ruin the romantic image of les amoureux, the two lovers in a vineyard drinking this wine together, but they do tend to express themselves in that way in the glass, I think, too. The wine you have in your glass, if you haven't drank it all already, this is Anne and Hervé Sigal. It is another ludicite called Boussière, and this is super classic Chambol, right? So it's 100% destemmed, which is a technique that winemakers can use to bring out higher tone, brighter styles of wine. You can essentially, with Pinot Noir, you can ferment with the stems on the grapes, which is called whole cluster. Or you can make your wine by pulling all the grapes off, usually with the machine now called a destemmer. And that's really classic for Chambol. And producers can choose to do one or the other, or a little bit of one. But this is all 100% destemmed. Anne and Hervé are that image that I mentioned earlier of the husband and wife that are very kind of down to earth and farmers and make their own wine. They do it all themselves. They've been doing it forever. And I think that they really kind of embody that small handcrafted image as well. So a great one to taste next door. Yeah, again, I think you have a nice bit of, it always reminds me of like potpourri or like sandalwood. I think the wines are pretty perfumed overall. Super delicious. All right, so we'll move on, and please continue to sample your wines and kind of see. I like to go back and forth and see what the differences are personally once I've had one or two. There's a couple of villages that we'll talk about quickly because they're sort of unremarkable. But Vougeot is the next village to the south. So we're continuing on our little route de Grand Cru as we go down. Vougeot is named after the vineyard Clos de Vougeot, again, a Clos. It's only famous, really, it is a Grand Cru vineyard, but it's famous mainly because it has the Chateau de Clos Vougeot. So that's where the Chevalier de Tastaven, which is the kind of like the primary Burgundy like confederation exists. It's their headquarters. They were founded in the 1930s. There are Tastaven chapters all over the world, and there's one here in New York. They hold all kinds of events and that kind of thing. But that's sort of like the Cistercian era chapel was built, and now they have taken it over. The Clos Vougeot, though, although it's a Grand Cru vineyard, is kind of unremarkable, as I mentioned, mainly because it's so huge. I mean, it's 50 hectares large. So if we're going to put that in American terms, 50 hectares is 133 acres. And if you want to go even more American, that's 101 football fields. So there's no way that anyone in the wine world believes that 101 football fields can make equal quality Grand Cru wine. They don't. There are some very good parcels in Clos Vougeot for sure, and certainly in the hands of the right producer, again, can always make a great wine. But there are also parts of Clos Vougeot, and I know this because I stepped in one, that are literally puddles. They are like they divot down into the ground, and that's just not it's just not anywhere near the same quality as something that's better drained and better exposition. So the wines are rather inconsistent in Clos Vougeot. As you continue south, you're now in a village called Flagey-Echezeaux, another unremarkable village, so unremarkable actually that they don't even have their own village name for wine. Now, I'm obviously using the word unremarkable on a scale of wines that like 99% of us like only drink on special occasions or never. So of course, this is also a Grand Cru vineyard. Echezeaux is the name of the vineyard. But if you want to make a wine outside of that of Echezeaux or its partner Grand Echezeaux, you have to label as Vin Romanée. And Vin Romanée is like kind of the holy grail, the grounds for the most expensive and greatest wines in the world, perhaps. So Echezeaux, though, really quickly before we move into the goods of Vin Romanée. I mentioned two Grand Crus, Echezeaux. It's also quite large, not really as large as Clos-Vougeot, maybe 30 or so hectares, a touch larger. But the better part of Echezeaux is called Grand Echezeaux, and that's a pretty serious wine overall. There's definitely large landowners in both, but there's tons of producers in each vineyard. I think kind of understanding the idea that lots of producers can make the same wine. I always, whenever I'm talking to like aspiring sommeliers, like bartenders and servers, and they're trying to understand, like, what do you mean that's that person's vineyard? They make that wine. Well, it's sort of like an apartment complex, right? Like we're all New Yorkers, we can definitely understand the apartment analogy. So essentially, the idea is that you can own your own apartment if you're lucky enough, and the housing market is in your favor. Then you can own your own apartment, but you're probably never going to own your entire apartment building, right? So that's very difficult to do. Some people do it in Burgundy for sure, and those are called monopoles. So if it's one producer in the whole vineyard, it's a monopole. And that sort of leads us into the importance of Vin Romanée, because this is really like the hallowed ground of Burgundy for sure. This is where the most expensive wine in the world is made, just statistically, which I'll tell you about in a second. But there are 6 Grand Cru vineyards here. 3 of them are monopoles. They have single landowners. And the other 3 are considered of extremely high quality overall. So these are really kind of like where the best, the most expensive, all the most prestigious producers are here, or most of the most prestigious producers are here. You're really talking about between Vin Romanée and Gevrey-Chambertin, the first village we talked about. Those are probably the 2 most prestigious and important villages in the Cote de Nuits, at least. So kind of mentioning this idea of a monopole, there are 2 very important producers that I'll bring up for you, and you probably encountered them. Maybe you even had the fortune of tasting some of them. One is called Ligier-Belair. And so he owns a vineyard, Louis Michel Ligier-Belair, in this era at least, named La Romanée. So you can see again, Vin Romanée, he owns La Romanée, the actual vineyard itself, but it's extremely, extremely small. Smallest vineyard in all of Burgundy, and actually in France as well. Then there's another famous producer named Domaine de Romanée-Conti, or we usually shorten to DRC when we're talking about them because it's a mouthful overall. And they also see the word Romany coming in here again. But they own 2 monopole vineyards, one called Tache, and the other one is called Romanée-Conti. And Romanée-Conti is that wine that I mentioned. That's the most expensive wine on release in the world. It's $5,000 a bottle, brand new. So a wine that you can't drink for 25 years costs you $5,000. And that's if you're buying it at wholesale. It's a little insane. But it is an exceptional vineyard. It is, again, sort of hallowed ground here overall. I'll show you another quick couple slides here, just because I think they're kind of funny. It's just me goofing around in Grand Cru vineyards, actually, in Burgundy. But I mentioned here you have La Romanée, and because I don't know what to do with myself and I'm super photo awkward, then this is, as I showed here, this is La Romanée, Ligier-Belair. I decided to do a Captain Morgan pose on it because I don't know what else to do. And then, of course, if you're talking about La Romanée-Conti and it's hallowed ground, I had to pretend to meditate on Romanée-Conti. So, I think the important thing is just to remember that like wine should be fun, and it's not, even though it is very, again, something very sacred. We shouldn't take it so seriously all the time. So anyway, that's really kind of the main aspect of Vin Romanée. The Premier Cru vineyards here are also quite fancy. They all of them but one touch a Grand Cru vineyard. So you can imagine that their pricing is also extremely extravagant overall. So wines that you might encounter would be like Malconsort or Cros Parentu or Beaumont, as well as there's many others. But these wines can outstrip a lot of Grand Cru vineyards as well. We're going to come into our last village. We're going to round the horn here on our final wine. And Nuits Saint-Georges is the village that is right to the south, directly to the south, I suppose we should say, of Vin Romanée. So Nuits Saint-Georges, as I mentioned, is the only village we're talking about today that doesn't have any Grand Cru vineyards, but it does have very good Premier Cru vineyards. When we were talking about the story of classifying the Grand Crus and Premier Crus, this producer, Henri Gouge, was located in this village, and that's one of the reasons why there are no Grand Crus here, because he didn't want to put his own wines ahead of his peers, and also wanted to make sure that they were able to actually get the classification system into law. So this is a pretty large village. It's kind of a commercial center, and there's a lot of manufacturing and stuff like that. You know, the highway runs like right through it, actually, the RN74. So it's overall fairly large, aside from Beaune. But the vineyards are sort of divided into this idea of the northern part of Nuits Saint-Georges tends to taste more like Vin Romanée, which is very, very spiced and savory and super elegant and lots of power, right? Because these are the greatest wines in the world. They're supposed to live forever, and they also take a long time to come around in their best form. And the wines from the south are, in fact, a little bit more rustic, and that's kind of the biggest difference in Nuits Saint-Georges. Is they're known for being a little more structured. The fruit is overall darker here, and you're starting to talk about things like black cherry or kind of like darker berried fruit, blueberry, whatever it might be, when you're talking about the fruit character of the wine. And they also tend to have a little bit more of like animal and barnyardy sorts of flavors and smells. If you have your third wine in front of you, then you can maybe start to pick up on some of those things as well. This is a producer named Desmontis. So they're actually a little further south than this village. They're in Volnay, but they make wine all up and down the Côte d'Or. They've been around since the 1730s. So they're in like their, whatever, 7th, 8th, 10th generation of winemaking here. But they are considered to be one of the most historic and important producers. They're one of the first to be imported to the US. So when we started to get Burgundy back in the 60s and 70s, they were one of the first on the market. In their wines from Nuits, I think they are pretty classic Nuits Saint-Georges style, and that they do tend to have a little bit more rustic edge. They'd have a little more animalistic note on the nose, and the tannins are a little grippier. They're a little grainier, for sure. But I kind of like that. So it's actually my personal favorite wine in the lineup overall. Obviously, I think they're all delicious, why I picked them for you. But I think this one is the most expressive currently, even though it does have a little bit more of that sort of like barnyardy note to it overall. So that is sort of like the Cote de Nuits in a nutshell. You were able to hopefully take in some of the information, and it was intriguing enough to retain some of it as well. I know we had a brief pause at the beginning of the class, so if anyone had any questions, I'll open it up now, and we can maybe take some questions verbally if you wanted to go back over something that maybe was kind of choppy at the very beginning, or if you had any questions for me about wine in general, or about my time in New York, or what it takes to have a career switch into becoming a sommelier, I'd be happy to answer any of those too. So yeah, I'm happy to open it up. Anyone would like to unmute for a second and try to jump in a question?
I must have missed that. You said career switch?
Yeah, if you're looking for a career switch and you want to become a sommelier, I'm happy to give you some advice on how to do so.
Did you do something before, or was this when
Oh,
did you decide to become a sommelier?
for me, yeah. I studied journalism in school. I think it's pretty common for sommeliers in the United States. You can't really study wine until you're 21, really. So by that time you probably had made your parents proud and signed up for university and had pretty much finished a career choice of some kind. But I started to get into wine working in restaurants actually. And so I'd always worked in restaurants through school to support myself, and that's sort of how I found wine. And as I left school, I never quite found the right job that I wanted to in my career field in media studies and journalism, and so I always kept on coming back to wine. And I decided that I would study it for real, and so I took some time to take the exams. And you don't have to take the exams by any means; they are very helpful to formalize your knowledge, but it's all self-study, right? So there's no like real like prep course that can get you there. You study wine on your couch. You talk to your wine director at the restaurant that you're working at the time. You taste a bunch of wines. You meet with people that are also studying, and then you can go in and take the exams. And then really you have to get in front of the wines and actually get a job as a sommelier. So the hardest one is the first one, I think, and then after that, it all sorts of fall into place. So, what do you guys think of the wines? Did anyone have a favorite they wanted to bring out to the group?
There's a comment here about the 18 being young but incredibly drinkable.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Great. That's on the chat. So yes, to the uninitiated, that's very funny. I think by signing up for the class, you've initiated yourself, Chris. So that's really the hallmark of this producer. And I was speaking with Jamie earlier today, who's gracious enough to donate his time to moderate this class, about the wines we had pitches, and we are both excited about Durocher because we work with them in our restaurants both here at Charlie Bird together, and then when we were at 11 Madison Park, we couldn't keep them really on the wine lists very long because they are quite delicious young. And that what we don't know yet, really, I think with this particular generation of winemaker is, will Pierre Durocher's wines age this well? Will they be like classic Gevrey in 10 more years? Because they are so delicious now. That's sort of a consequence of the wine market overall. I mean, needing and wanting to have wines that are drunk much younger. I'd say just a brief stat that always sticks with me is that in the United States, something like 90% of wine that is purchased is drunk within 4 hours of purchase. So we buy wines to drink that night. We buy them on the way to the dinner party that we forgot to get wine from, as opposed to buying wines, cellaring them, and then having this cycle of actually having old wine to choose from. It's very difficult to do, and we're just not that's not a part of our culture. We're very instant gratification oriented in general, but that's something that we would probably serve ourselves better to get a little bit more self-restraint. I'm guilty of it too, by the way. I buy wine and drink it the same day all the time, so I'm not above it by any means. I saw a question over here too. Do you keep your reds chilled? I think we'll answer that, and I'll let you all go since I've taken an hour of your time. But yes, keep your reds slightly chilled. I cellar my reds and whites both at home and in the restaurant at 55 Fahrenheit. So if you're storing them before you drink them, store them at 55. If you're going to drink your whites, they should be a little cooler. So maybe 43 to 45. So you can stick them in the refrigerator for 20 minutes, half an hour before you open it, and then you're good. For reds, I would pull them out and let them kind of air out and open up on the table or on your countertop or whatever as you drink them. So reds should be served like just below room temperature, like in the low 60s. So if you allow them to sort of open up in the glass and open on the bottle, then you're in good shape. So yes. Oh, we have one more quick question. You mentioned 15 minutes a great year.
I have an additional one as well, Watson.
Go ahead. Okay, I'll answer this 15 question really fast, and then I'll go to Jamie. You mentioned 15 was a great year. What are the years are great for reds, and what should we look for? Yeah, so I'll give you a quick rundown of maybe to the last 20-ish years, 15, 20 years. So 15 is great for reds. Well, we'll start with 17. We know 17 typically for whites, but you can see you have two 17s in front of you. They're also pretty expressive for reds. 15 for reds are great. Then you're going to jump a few years and you're going to go probably back to 2010 and then 9. Those would be your other two great years. 05 beyond that. And then we get an anomaly year in 2002 is considered to be an epic year for both reds, whites, one of the greatest years in the last 100 years. Basically 2002 and 1996 would be your last two kind of great years for both reds and whites. And then if you're in the early 90s, you're thinking 93 for reds, and then 90 is always a great year for everything. In fact, including people. I happen to be a 90. Epic year for wines and people all around the world, actually, in most regions. What was the last question you had, Jamie, as well?
Yeah, sorry, I'm just processing your shameless 90s plug as an 80s baby. Pardon me. There was a question just about the ability for the wines to taste so different and yet come from land that is so close. And I kind of already offline explained how this is part of the fascination of Burgundy and why people like ourselves will kind of just do the deep dive for their life. But I thought it'd be a good one to maybe just open up. To me, it covers the notion of terroir in general, but I just wanted to kind of lob that your way.
Yeah, totally. I think that's a great way to tie everything back together, right? And that's sort of the idea of that I can pick 3 wines that are from a stretch of land that takes you only 20 minutes to drive up and down. But the idea in Burgundy is that they really focus on this concept that Jamie said, which is terroir, which is sort of this abstract notion of the sum of all of the parts of the influence in the wine, primarily the climate, the exposition, the soil type, the person that made it in terms of guiding the wine from the grape into the glass, right? So terroir is really a super important and very sort of esoteric French notion for like really good dirt, more or less. So the fact that things in Burgundy are roughly around the same band, but the soil is so varied. The sun will hit the grapes at different times of the day. The hills are very rolling, so sometimes a vineyard might get all southeast facing exposure, or maybe it's only all eastern exposure. These are all like ways that a wine can express themselves differently. And then you also have the hand of the winemaker as well, right? So whether we talked about with that second wine, the one where they chose to take the stems entirely off the grapes, so they choose to keep the stems on. How much oak do they use? They use a lot of oak. They use a little oak. All these are different winemaking choices that will allow the wine to be sort of to be classic for its place, or not classic for its place, and more of a producer-oriented style. But as Jamie said, like it is a deep dive, and it's something that you can never know everything about, which I think is why people that study wine or that drink wine start to get into it, because you can never you can never know it all. And as soon as you think you do, you've learned something that totally humbles you, and you're back to learning something new again. So I'm really happy that the wines did express to you all differently, and that you can see some of these differences that manifest in the glass. That is a big win overall. For now, I think I'll leave you for this week. This is going to be an ongoing series. So this was our first one. We really thank you all so much for coming to join us. We're going to be taking a week or two off for the holidays, so you all can, socially distant, visit your families while remaining safe and responsible. And then we'll see you all back in kind of probably the first week of January. You can check out our email list, which you probably already are on. If you signed up for the class, we'll send you another email when the next one's coming out. We'll do the white wines of Burgundy next, actually, and then we'll move into some other regions from Italy and France, and we'll kind of switch it up. But you can also always reach out to our Instagram accounts, either Charlie Bird or Pasquale Jones. You can reach out to me directly on Instagram. I'm more than happy to field questions you have. I'm at Dr. Watsom. It's dr. Watsom, Watsomm. It's always a good place to reach out to me there too. So thank you all again so much. Have a happy holidays. Stay safe. and we'll see you all in a few weeks. Thanks, guys.